For 24 years, Judge Rebecca Langston ruled her courtroom with an iron fist until one man flipped the script. Lies, power, and corruption collide in a battle for justice. Stay till the end to see how it all unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories. The verdict was decided before the trial. Even began Jefferson County Courthouse, Alabama. It was an old building, grand but weary, like a king who had ruled too long and had lost his way. The thick oak doors had been pushed open by thousands of desperate hands over the decades. Hands of men and women hoping for justice. But those who stepped inside Judge Rebecca Langston's courtroom quickly learned one thing. Hope didn't belong here. For 24 years, Rebecca Langston had been the law. She was untouchable, unshakable, the kind of judge whose rulings didn't just affect cases. They shaped lives, ruined families, decided who walked free and who disappeared behind bars. Her power didn't come from yelling or banging her gavel. No, Langston didn't need theatrics. She controlled her courtroom with a simple glance over her reading glasses, her sharp, cold eyes slicing through attorneys like they were minor inconveniences. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The system worked exactly the way she wanted it to. Everyone in Jefferson County's legal community knew the unspoken truth. If you were a white defendant, your chances were good. If you were black, you'd better pray for a miracle. Attorneys whispered about her in hushed tones at bar association meetings. Public defenders warned their clients before stepping into her courtroom. But no one, not a single person, had ever dared to challenge her. Until today. The case that should have been over before it started. At exactly 8:59 a.m., a pair of polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as Marcus Hayes stepped into the courtroom. He was 48 years old, built like a former athlete who had traded the gym for the law library. His sharp suit and confident stride carried an air of defiance, one that didn't go unnoticed by Langston, who barely glanced up from her paperwork but tightened her lips just slightly. She already hated him, not because of anything he had done today, not because of the case he was here for. She hated him because he was him. Marcus had made a name for himself by taking the cases that no one else would. He was the kind of defense attorney who didn't just fight for his clients. He fought against the entire system that sought to crush them. He had battled against rigged juries, corrupt DAs, and prejudiced judges before, but this was different. Today, he wasn't just here to win a case. He was here to make history. He glanced to the defense table where Samuel Carter, his client, sat. A 32-year-old black man, Samuel had been accused of armed robbery, a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him was flimsy at best. A grainy surveillance video showing a man in a hoodie, a nervous store clerk who thought he recognized him, and a prosecution team eager to make sure someone paid for the crime. But it didn't matter. In Langston's courtroom, innocence wasn't enough to save you. Marcus approached the defense table, lowering his voice as he leaned toward his client. "You good?" he asked. Samuel exhaled sharply. He had been in and out of the system since he was a teenager, not because he was a criminal, but because being black in Alabama meant you didn't get second chances. "I don't know, man," Samuel muttered. "I feel like I already lost." Marcus straightened, adjusting his tie. "Not today." The queen of the courtroom, Judge Langston, finally acknowledged Marcus, tilting her head slightly. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice as smooth as polished stone, "you're already on thin ice in my courtroom. I suggest you don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. They hadn't even started. Marcus kept his expression unreadable, but inside his blood boiled. "I'll try not to, Your Honor." Langston smirked, shifting her gaze to the prosecution table. Seated there was Ethan Caldwell, an ambitious young assistant district attorney fresh out of law school. He had the smugness of a man who believed in the system because the system had always worked in his favor. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Caldwell announced, flashing a knowing glance toward Marcus. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Marcus let his gaze sweep across the room, the jury, the gallery, the press. Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, already sensing the weight of what was about to happen. Others watched with thinly veiled anticipation, knowing that something was different about today. Langston exhaled through her nose. Let's get this over with. The game begins. From the moment the trial started, it was clear that this wasn't a trial. It was a performance. Langston played her role flawlessly. Every objection Marcus raised, dismissed. Every shaky argument from Caldwell, corrected and guided like a favored student. Every motion Marcus filed, overruled before he could finish his sentence. She didn't even pretend to be impartial. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And Marcus noticed. He had been in hostile courtrooms before, but this was different. Langston wasn't just biased. She was bold about it. She didn't care if people saw it. She had been untouchable for 24 years, and today was just another day of flexing that power. But what she didn't realize was that Marcus had been waiting for this exact moment. The warning signs of a storm. Halfway through the morning, Marcus caught Langston watching him, not just with contempt, but with something else. Suspicion. Because somewhere deep inside her, she knew. She knew that Marcus wasn't like the others. She knew that something felt different about today. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she was walking straight into the biggest trap of her life. Because Marcus wasn't just here to win this case, he was here to bring her entire empire down. And before the day was over, Rebecca Langston would learn what it felt like to lose control of her courtroom. For the first time in 24 years. The trap is set. The courtroom felt heavier than usual, not because of the Alabama heat pressing against the grand stone walls, but because something unspoken hung in the air. People sensed it. The jury shifted uneasily in their seats. The gallery, packed with reporters and courtroom regulars, watched with rapt attention. Even the court officers, who had served under Judge Rebecca Langston for years, stole glances at her, almost as if waiting for something. Langston noticed. She adjusted her reading glasses, her fingers tightening slightly around the gavel as she glared at Marcus Hayes. She could feel it, a change, a challenge, and she did not like it. The defense strikes back. Marcus stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he walked toward the witness stand. The prosecution had just put John Parker, the store clerk who had allegedly identified Samuel Carter, on the stand. Parker was nervous. Marcus could see it. The man's hands twitched against the wooden rail, his gaze darting between Langston and Caldwell, as if unsure of what he was allowed to say. "Mr. Parker," Marcus began smoothly, "you testified that you saw my client, Samuel Carter, on the night of the robbery. Are you absolutely certain?" Parker licked his lips, hesitated. Langston leaned forward. Her presence was a warning. I think so," Parker finally said. Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but inside he knew that hesitation was his way in. "You think so?" he repeated, his tone careful. "Or you know so?" Parker swallowed hard. I mean, I thought I saw him, but—" "Move on, Mr. Hayes." Langston cut in abruptly, her voice sharp. A dangerous silence fell over the courtroom. Marcus turned his head slowly toward her. He did not blink. "Your Honor, I believe the witness was about to clarify his statement." Langston's lips pursed. "And I said, move on, Mr. Hayes." The tension in the room was palpable. The jury exchanged glances. The gallery held its breath. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "For the record, Your Honor," he said, his voice even, "you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own statement." Langston's face twitched. "I am warning you, Mr. Hayes." Marcus smiled, just slightly. "Understood, Your Honor." He turned back to Parker, but the damage had already been done. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. Langston had overplayed her hand. The courtroom begins to turn. As the trial progressed, Marcus continued pressing. Each time Langston ruled against him unfairly, he made sure the jury noticed. Each time Caldwell fumbled, he let the room see how Langston propped him up. And it was working. Marcus could see the doubt creeping into the jury's expressions. He could see the reporters taking frantic notes. Langston could feel it too. She was losing control. She had ruled this courtroom for 24 years, bending it to her will. But now, right now, the walls were closing in. The unexpected move Langston needed to shut this down. She straightened in her chair. "Mr. Caldwell, continue with your questioning," she ordered, her voice colder now. Caldwell, rattled but determined, nodded quickly and turned back to Parker. "Mr. Parker, just to clarify, You do believe the defendant was at the scene, correct? Parker hesitated again. And then, he glanced at Marcus. Langston saw it. Her patience snapped. Mr. Parker, she said sharply, you will answer the prosecution's question. The room went silent. Marcus saw something flicker in Parker's eyes. Fear, but not of Marcus, of Langston. And then, something no one expected happened. Parker shifted forward, gripped the microphone tightly, and took a deep breath. I'm not sure anymore, he said. The courtroom gasped. Langston's fingers curled around the armrests of her chair. Caldwell's face paled. Marcus? He didn't move. Because this was exactly what he had been waiting for. The fall of the Queen Langston could not let this spiral out of control. She slammed her gavel so hard that the sound echoed against the marble walls. That is enough, she barked. The courtroom jumped. I will not allow this trial to be turned into a circus. Mr. Parker, your testimony stands. You identified the defendant, and that is final. Final. As if Langston could decide what the truth was. Marcus inhaled deeply. This was bigger than Samuel Carter now. This was about every case Langston had ever presided over. Every man she had sentenced unfairly. Every piece of justice she had strangled in her grip. And she had just given him everything he needed. Marcus slowly reached for his briefcase. Inside there were documents, files, recordings, proof. He had been building this case against Langston for years, but before he could pull them out, the courtroom doors swung open. Two men in dark suits strode inside, federal agents. Langston's breath hitched. Marcus closed his briefcase. It was time. The fall of a giant. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Rebecca Langston lost control of her courtroom. The double doors swung open, and the air shifted. Two federal agents strode in, their movements crisp and decisive. They didn't hesitate. They didn't glance around the room searching for permission. They already knew why they were here. The gallery murmured in hushed excitement. The jury members shifted uncomfortably. Even the court officers, the same ones who had followed Langston's every command without question, looked uncertain. Marcus Hayes sat still, his expression unreadable. Inside, his heart pounded, but not with fear, with anticipation. It was finally happening. Langston's eyes flickered between the agents and Marcus. Suspicion, irritation, the faintest glimmer of fear, and then anger. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, gripping the edges of the bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white. One of the agents, a tall, no-nonsense man with a government badge clipped to his belt, stepped forward. His voice was steady, unshakable. Judge Rebecca Langston, we need to speak with you immediately. Langston straightened. She would not be humiliated in her own courtroom. I am in the middle of a trial. The agent didn't budge. This cannot wait. The room went silent. Caldwell, the young prosecutor who had been so smug under Langston's protection, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of what was happening sink into every corner of the room. Should we take a recess, Your Honor? Caldwell asked weakly. Langston's fingers curled tighter around her bench. No, she snapped. We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow— Judge Langston, the agent cut in, we have a warrant for your arrest. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Court clerks whispered to one another in shock. Langston's face drained of color. For 24 years, she had ruled this courtroom. No one had ever questioned her authority. Now she was being dragged from her own bench like a common criminal. The tables turned. Langston stood abruptly, defiant, unyielding. This is outrageous, she spat. The agent didn't blink. You are being charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, abuse of power, and multiple civil rights violations. Another wave of shocked murmurs. Langston's breathing quickened. This wasn't happening. This was her courtroom. This was her kingdom. She turned to Marcus. The realization dawned. You. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus stood, straightening his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs, His expression was calm, controlled. "Me," he said, feigning innocence. Langston's hands trembled. He had done this. He had played the long game. He had built the case against her. And now he had won. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Langston had spent decades lecturing defendants about accountability, responsibility, and respect for the law. Now she stood before the very system she had abused. Marcus stepped forward, locking eyes with her. "Justice, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "I follow the law, even when the law fails people like me." The desperate last move. But Langston wasn't done yet. She wasn't going down without a fight. "This is a setup," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "This is politically motivated. I demand my lawyer." The lead agent pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. But before he could finish, Langston made her move. She bolted. The room gasped as Langston spun on her heel, trying to rush past the agents toward the side exit. But she wasn't fast enough. The second agent caught her wrist, twisting her arms behind her back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom. A moment no one had ever imagined witnessing. Langston, the once untouchable judge, bound in steel restraints. The very same cold metal she had ordered onto the wrists of so many others. The final humiliation. A court officer, one who had worked under Langston for years, stepped forward to hold the door open. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For years she had walked through these halls as royalty. Now she was just another defendant. Langston hesitated. For the first time in her life, she had no power. Then she stepped forward. The doors slammed shut behind her. And just like that, Rebecca Langston was gone. But the fight wasn't over. The courtroom was still in shock. Samuel Carter, the man Langston had tried so hard to condemn, was still in handcuffs at the defense table. Langston was gone, but her verdict still remained. Marcus turned, facing Caldwell, the young prosecutor who now looked like a child without a babysitter. "Your Honor," Marcus said, now addressing the new judge who had rushed in to take over proceedings. "Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The new judge, a seasoned, level-headed black man, folded his hands in thought. "On what grounds, Mr. Hayes?" Marcus turned, addressing the jury, the gallery, the reporters. "On the grounds that this entire trial was poisoned from the start. Judge Langston's arrest proves that she was never impartial. My client was never given a fair trial. And now that the woman who orchestrated this injustice is in handcuffs, the only thing left to do is undo the damage she caused." A long pause, then the judge nodded. "I agree." He turned to the bailiff. "Remove the defendant's restraints. The charges are dismissed." For a split second, no one moved. Then, Samuel Carter let out a breath he had been holding for years. The war wasn't over yet. Samuel turned to Marcus, shaking his head. "I thought people like her never paid for what they did." Marcus glanced at the empty judge's bench. "They do," he said. "Eventually." But he knew this wasn't the end. Langston was just one of many. There were others like her. And Marcus Hayes? He wasn't done yet. Justice is a long game. The courtroom was frozen in time. Samuel Carter's handcuffs hit the table with a metallic clang, the sound reverberating through the silent room. For months, he had been treated like a criminal. For years, he had been taught that the system wasn't built for men like him. But now, he was free. Marcus Hayes remained still. He had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. The aftermath of a fallen judge. The reporters in the gallery had never written so fast in their lives. Langston's arrest was already breaking news. It would be the biggest legal scandal in Alabama in decades. Lawyers whispered among themselves, if she's guilty, how many of her rulings need to be overturned? How deep does this corruption go? They all knew the answer, deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Caldwell, the prosecutor who had once strutted with confidence, sat motionless, his hands gripping the edges of his desk like a man staring at a sinking ship. His career was over. Langston had been his shield. Now she was gone, and with her, his entire future crumbled. Marcus didn't waste another second on him. The real fight wasn't over. He turned to Samuel, who was still sitting at the defense table, rubbing his wrist where the cuffs had been. Samuel looked at him stunned. "What do I do now?" he asked. Marcus exhaled. The answer was obvious. "You walk out of here." The price of justice. As Samuel stepped out of the courtroom, sunlight hit his face. It had been months since he had felt fresh air without chains on his wrists. He glanced at Marcus. "So that's it?" he asked. "I just go home?" Marcus shook his head. "Number, now you start living again." Samuel nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Because deep down, he knew the truth. They had won today. But how many more men like him had been sent away under Langston's rule? How many more were still rotting in cells because of a corrupt system that never cared about them? Marcus had thought about that too, which is why he wasn't done. The system still needs fixing. The moment Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, a swarm of reporters descended on him. Microphones were shoved in his face. Cameras flashed. Questions fired from all directions. "Mr. Hayes, did you know about the FBI investigation before today? What happens to Judge Langston's past cases? Do you think there are other judges like her?" Marcus raised a hand. The crowd hushed. He locked eyes with the cameras. This was his moment. "Today wasn't just about Judge Langston," he said, his voice strong, unwavering. "Today was about every person who has ever walked into a courtroom expecting fairness, only to find out that the system was rigged against them." The reporters leaned in. "Langston is just one judge, one name, but the corruption she represents, that runs deep." A pause. Then Marcus delivered the final blow. "She fell today, but there are others like her, and we're coming for them next." The war continues. Somewhere in a cold jail cell, Rebecca Langston sat alone. Her power was gone. Her legacy was in ruins. Her name would be forever tainted in the history books. But outside, the fight was just beginning. Marcus Hayes walked down the courthouse steps, his mind already turning. There were more cases to overturn, more lives to save, more battles to fight. Because justice was never a guarantee. It had to be taken, and he wasn't stopping now.